And thanks for coming out on a very beautiful sunlit evening to a dark space to talk about something which is dear to our hearts, but might be considered or overlooked by many people, which is the idea of transliteration. Transliteration essentially is the change of scripts, but within the same language, right? It's not translation. Translation is very noble. There's departments devoted to it. That's actually an increasing area of scholarly study. You could say it's a trending area of scholarly study. Even the very notion of translation has become sort of problematized, and it's quite an interesting one. Very famous authors have done it: Edgar Allan Poe, Vladimir Nabokov, et cetera, et cetera. Transliteration is a little bit like the kind of trashier younger sibling of translation. Nobody really thinks about it, but if you read or write a non-Latin-based language, like I do in Persian, let's say, or in Russian, or Chinese, or Greek, you're usually doing it quite often. I don't bother. I can write in Russian and I can read, but I don't bother typing on my computer or SMSs. I just write in sort of Latin Russian or Finglish, Farsi, Latin. But there's, of course, a lot that happens with alphabets, right? Alphabets are not in any way innocent. There's a reason why certain alphabets have accompanied empires, whether it's the Latin alphabet with the secularization of the Western world, the Cyrillic alphabet with the rise of Orthodox Christianity, and then communism, let's say several centuries later, and of course the Arabic alphabet with the rise of Islam. But to start off, I wanted to just, are there any French speakers in this, in the room? Can I pull this out? I think I'm not getting the reception, actually. It's from, does anybody speak French here? Nobody? Don't be shy. I'll try my best then. So this is I'm going to read this in French, and maybe you can tell me what it makes out in English. Un petit dumpty, c'est un osal. Un petit dumpty a des gretfal. Indolent qui ne sans cesse, indolent qui se mène, qu'importe un petit dumpty together again. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So this is not transliteration. Of course, this is something else, which is just even stranger than transliteration. It's called homophonic translation. It's essentially translating into the same. It's translating or transcribing to the same alphabet. So it's English nursery rhymes transcribed into a French phonetic idiom. And the cover of the book is Mother Goose Rhymes, Mother Goose Rhymes, right? And it's an entire book of nursery rhymes which have been transcribed into a French phonetic alphabet. It becomes even weirder here. This is a good example of transliteration by a poet who I'm really regret not reaching out to before he passed away, I think in 2022. His name is David Melnick. He was a kind of pioneering queer poet in the Bay Area, and he did a transliteration. He did a homophonic transliteration and homoerotic transliteration of the whole of the Iliad into Latin. And there's two different things happening here. He's transliterating the Iliad from the Greek. I can't read Greek, but because I can read Russian, I can kind of make out the letters. But doing it in a homoerotic idiom at the same time as doing it in a homophonic one. So here you can see it says, aid us to make gay toast. If you ain't a kissed A-OK. Stayed a rue perk, a phallus came. Stayed a rue perk. So he's perk, a phallus came. So he's done this in the entirety of the Iliad, right? Which is quite something as a work. As Chawan mentioned, we started out publishing. It's really the main activity of our. Well, I wouldn't say the main activity, but we've published over 12 books to date. Most of the time when artists publish books, usually books are either fanzines or artist books where you have to kind of put gloves on and they're precious and they cost a lot and there's only 10 editions, or they're documentation and catalogs. This is neither of those in the sense that they exist in sort of print runs of 2,000 or 3,000 copies. They're offset print. You can buy them on Amazon. They never cost more than 30 euros or $30. They're available as PDFs. But they sit in between in what's normally, and if you think about the hierarchy that unfortunately characterizes the milieu in which we work, at the top of the pyramid is the artworks that museums and galleries commission or sell or acquire. And then down the pyramid, sort of downstream, is the print work, right? Because print is somehow, the edition, inevitably the institution says, oh, can you please do an edition to help us fundraise, or you make editions that are more affordable. But what we try to do with Slav and Tatars is in some ways invert this pyramid in the sense that all the, let's say, the expensive, elaborate things that are being commissioned by institutions or being sold by galleries and collectors are paying far too much for, they're actually all props to bring people back to the print. In my opinion, the real work are the books that we do. And so it's a kind of, it's an attempt to invert that pyramid. Normally when an institution invites you for a show, they, well, this is kind of pre-COVID, pre-crisis times, but they would allocate, let's say, 15% of the budget for documentation or catalog, right? So the institution says to you, Payam, you have this much for your exhibition, but we've taken this much from the budget that we'd like to do a book with you, a publication. Who would you like to invite to write about you? So we would think of like an esteemed curator or a critic to write about us. We invite them, they write about us, they make us look good, we make them look good. In any other industry, this would be totally illegal and insider trading. But in the art world, it's like normal, right? Because it's just somehow, maybe because we're unregulated, I don't know why. I don't really understand the point of wasting paper and time and design on a tool which is purely a kind of a marketing tool, or kind of if it's supposed to be true criticism, then there should be some kind of firewall, right? If I invite a critic to write about us, he or she is not going to be very honest. When somebody comes to your house for dinner, they're not going to tell you what they really think about the food, right? And that has paid off. So none of these books you won't find any of our work in these books. They're different, let's say, platforms for research, and we'll talk about a couple of them tonight. Again, it's not because we're control freaks, but it's resulted in some interesting things. I mean, we've had, I think we're the only artists that I know of, at least in our generation, that has an 8-page negative review. Usually there's a kind of unstated rule in press, which is you don't write about things you don't like about. But we actually had like an 8-page After All, an 8-page sort of takedown, which was great. Actually, it was the reason, we need more of these things. It was hard to swallow as an artist, but it actually forces you to really clarify and understand your position and push back and engage in a dialogue. Whereas if I had asked that person to write about us, a person I respect, they never would have done that into our face, let's say, right? Now, our approach to much of our material is we talk about sort of resuscitating the material, and I use this word resuscitation not lightly, because resuscitation really means putting your lips onto the lips of your research or your archival research and breathing life into it. Now, the difference between resuscitation and a French kiss is that nobody asks you, like, this is not a romantic gesture, it's a gesture of urgency, right? There's nothing kind of sensual about it. It's just you put your lips, but it's affective. It has to be, in some ways, Slavs and Tatars was also founded to kind of put pressure on this very Enlightenment idea that to understand your body of research, you have to have distance towards it. I think it was Wael Shaki who said it in an artist talk many years ago I attended, where he was talking about the Cabaret Crusades, and he said, he wanted to be very close, almost like a bear hug with the material. And sometimes it's interesting to actually be so close to your material that you're sweating with your material. And in that sense, you can also be analytical at the same time as being somehow affective with it as well. Another way to describe this approach is a figure has become a kind of a mascot of our practice. His name is Mullah Nasruddin. The Turks call him Hoja Nasruddin. The Arabs call him Johan Nasruddin. He's a figure like our region that basically everywhere there were Muslims living, there's this figure, from Croatia, from the Balkans essentially to China and down to the Sahara, Sub-Sahara. Nasruddin is in some ways the equivalent, I guess, in Western folklore. He's a wise man fool, and his anecdotes of Nasruddin play the role that anecdotes of, let's say, or fairy tales of like La Fontaine's fables, like allegories of animals or the Brothers Grimm. Essentially, parents tell children stories about Nasruddin, and through these stories, very simple stories for children, there's much more complex layers of perspective, morality, ethics. A typical Nasruddin story, for example, is somebody's on one side of the river and yells to Nasruddin, Hoja, Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river? And Nasruddin answers, you are on the other side of the river. So it's like very first degree, but behind that first degree humor, there's a lot happening. In some ways, he's I like to think of him as a kind of proto-Borat Ali G, like a 12th century, like stupid questions, but smart things happening behind it. Actually, my favorite Nasruddin anecdote is, they ask him why he's always facing backwards on his donkey. And he says, there's no point in me and the donkey looking in the same direction. And this, looking in the direction of the past, is actually something for us has become quite important. We take it from a book called, on the right, Les Anti-Modernes, by Antoine Compagnon, a French professor of literature at Columbia University. And what this person does is he traces, he says the true modernists are not the Mayakovskis and the Marinettis that we learned about, the people who believed in the Industrial Revolution and machine age. Today's equivalent would be the kind of Elon Musks who believe that technology will kind of deliver us from all of our weaknesses. He says the real modernists are the anti-moderns, people who had a conflicting relationship with the past, people who are looking always over their shoulder or in the rearview mirror towards the past. And Nasruddin is often depicted right on his donkey backwards because he's looking towards the past. He's moving to the future, but he's facing the past. Now, the languages that I speak, unfortunately, are all Indo-European. And in those languages, the way that we talk about future spatially and past, it shows how positivist our thinking is, how naive we are, because we say the future is ahead of us, because we imagine we know where we're going. The past is behind us because it's somehow irrelevant, otherwise it wouldn't be behind us. And if anything, the past 15, 20 years has shown us is that we have absolutely no fucking idea where we're going, right? When we started Slavs and Tatars in 2006, I was thinking about this recently. It was really quaint. The reason we're called Slavs and Tatars, it was a piss take about the concern following the entry of 10 new member states into the European Union. If you remember, everybody in the West, in England, in France, was worried about the Polish plumber and the Bulgarian construction worker. Those were good times. If that's your concern, I will take that back any day now, you know? Now it's much, much worse today, right? And so I wonder sometimes, you know, like I had a dark moment recently thinking, well, I look back at 20 years and say, oh, these were good. You know, 2024 was actually a good time compared to 2044. I hope not, but the only language I know that doesn't have this kind of spatial understanding of time is Malgache, the language in Madagascar, spoken in Madagascar, because in Madagascar, actually, the future is positioned as behind you, and the past is in front of you, the way that it's spatially considered, the way that it's idiomatically expressed. So we created a Mullah Nasruddin figure for the Guangzhou Biennial in 2012, I think, or 11. And the first thing that, of course, a child that jumps onto this thing asks his or her parent is, why am I holding this old man's belly? You know, why is the old man not facing the other way? And then the parent has to do exactly what Nasruddin's stories did, which is present in a digestible, comestible, understandable format to a 6 or 9-year-old questions of progress, of perspective, of ethics, of morality, etc. Now, one of another kind of sort of modus operandi of our practice is something that I call the metaphysical splits, which is not the splits of the legs, but the splits of the mind, in the sense of trying to wrap your brain around two conflicting ideas, two conflicting registers, sort of bringing together two things you normally don't put together in one page, in one voice, in one space. In English, again, the terms for this kind of practice is, most of them are not even English, I guess, they're Latin-based. Amphibole means expressing two contradictory ideas in one sentence. Cognitive dissonance, you're all familiar with. My favorite is actually coincidentio oppositorum, which is a Christian idea, which is that to express the otherworldly, you have to use non-rational language. So basically, you have to express unholy language to be holy, or you have to kind of, it's a very kind of antinomian idea, like in the way that some dervishes act crazy, or basically to express the transcendent, you cannot use rational language, because rational language is the language of humans, and we are kind of transactional creatures. The first time we used transliteration in a work of ours, and I'm finally coming to the idea of script changes, is a piece called Dig the Booty of Monoglots. And now most of you are, when I present this to non-English speaking audiences, you can imagine how difficult it is to explain this, but dig the booty of monoglots, but marry my child a polyglot. Now, normally people who start their sentences with dig the booty in English don't end the sentence with polyglot or monoglot, because they're just generally two different registers of language. One is more, whatever you want to call it, official, scholarly. The other one is more sort of slang. And here, for those of you who can read either the Persian Arabic or the Cyrillic, it says the same thing, dig the booty of monoglots. There's no in Russian or Cyrillic, so you have to say bat, marry my child a polyglot. Essentially, if you want to, I don't need to translate this for most of you, I guess, but for those of you who do, if you want to sort of mess around and have a one-night stand, do it with somebody who speaks one language. But if you're more serious, do it with somebody who speaks more than one language. Now, as I mentioned, the idea of transliteration is something which is transactional, but because it's transactional, it's something which doesn't receive a lot of the kind of scholarly attention that perhaps it should. Another example of coincidentia oppositorum, or this metaphysical splits, is Shawan mentioned the two geographical walls that we in our bio, the Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China. These are anachronistic walls. Again, normally people don't put these two walls in the same phrase because they have nothing to do with one another. When is the Great Wall of China built? 11th, 12th century? Yeah? And the Berlin Wall, of course, 20th century. But also another thing you normally don't, the kind of the geopolitical narratives of our region are political Islam and communism. Normally, when we started Slavs and Tatars, it wasn't so common to put these two together. Now it's become a bit more common, but one of our books is it looks at the legacy of the relationship between Poland and Iran, and today it's understood that 1979, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, is considered to be the second most important event of the 20th century. In the same way that 1917, the Russian Revolution, defined the 20th century, the 1979 Revolution of Iran has defined the last 40 years, and it's not a coincidence that when the USSR invaded Afghanistan and started its decline, Iran's revolution happened, and Iran became, until recently, until the Ukraine war, until the invasion of Ukraine, Iran was for the past 40 years the enemy of the West, or the United States, or the UK, let's say. It became the kind of the bad guy that had replaced Russia. Now Russia's sort of back to that list in some sense. But normally people also don't put Marx and Muhammad in the same slide, especially if you don't want Molotov cocktails thrown through your window. But as I mentioned, we're not the only ones to do this. Actually, Olivier Roy, who is quite an important sociologist, French sociologist, he, following 9/11, he immediately after 9/11 was talking about how in France, and the kind of the radicalization of youth in the Parisian banlieue, he said it's important for us not to talk about the radicalization of Islam, but the Islamicization of radicalism. And what he meant by that is that, in the 70s, if you were radical, you would be a Trotskyist. But because the left collapsed, what took the place of that was the only, I won't say it's a viable ideology because I don't agree with it, but let's say the only alternative as a radical ideology with the fall of leftism in the 80s, in the 90s and 2000s, until the rise of the right recently, was political Islam. Now, another person who's compared these two things is a gentleman named Norman Brown. Norman Brown is a really interesting figure. He was a professor of comparative literature at University of California, Santa Cruz, which is a kind of, this legendary school where Angela Davis and, Donna Haraway and everybody teaches. He was a darling of the kind of anti-establishment left, and he was a scholar, he was a psychoanalytical scholar, but the last 10 years of his life he devotes it to reading the Quran, not because he becomes a Muslim. He actually remains a Methodist his whole life, but he basically says that until Finnegan's Wake was published by James Joyce, that we couldn't understand the Quran because we didn't have the tools to understand modernist literature. He talks about the Quran as kind of proto-modernist literature. Why? If you compare the Quran with the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew and the Christian Bible, in the Hebrew and Christian Bible, time is linear. A is before B is before C, characters remain the same. In the Quran, it's a little bit like watching a Tarantino film or like a David Lynch. You turn one page of the Quran, Joseph is Hagar, the next page is Jesus, the next page is Muhammad. And people sort of transmogrify, exactly like that scene. Do you remember, have any of you seen Lost Highway by David Lynch? Nobody's seen Lost Highway? There's a completely inexplicable scene where you just pull out, and all of a sudden, Bill Pullman has been replaced by Balthazar Getty for no reason whatsoever, as explained to you. In a similar way, and so actually Norman Brown says, he actually finds 110 of the 117 chapter headings of the Quran in Finnegan's Wake. Now, granted, if you try hard enough, I'm sure you can find whatever you want in Finnegan's Wake. But he says, Norman Brown says that he calls communism and Islam, he calls communism and Islam two old revolutionary forces, two old horses, tired old horses, but that we should not take any pleasure from their failure because Islam and communism share the idea that there shall be one world or there shall be none. Now, that's a utopian, but also can be a dystopian idea, one world or none, right? To go back to language, the idea of language politics and how this impacts sort of empires, the first book we published about alphabets was a book called and it's all about the sound in 3 different alphabets. The Hebrew is this chet, this is the Cyrillic and this is the Arabic Now, there's something weird about because it's in all 3 of those alphabets, it has a certain, sacred symbolism. The word for life in Hebrew is chet. The numerology in the Arabic numerology, or even in the Hebrew, in the gematria, or even in the Kabbalah, it has I can just sum it up for you that it's considered to be kind of a sacred phoneme in some sense. What's interesting from us is that most phonemes are pronounced by pushing air through your vocal tract, right? When we're speaking, we're always pushing air through. That's how we speak. Is actually the constriction of that air. So you're actually stopping the air passing through your vocal tract. Even more difficult for some audiences is as I said Quran recently. We transliterate the Quran with a K or a Q. It's not Quran, it's Quran. Is it's like the GH equivalent of It's even further out in the throat. Turkic languages have it. Turkish has lost it, unfortunately. But if you go east of Turkey to Central Asia, the more you go east, the more it becomes a guttural language. Now, I used to joke that is a kind of anti-imperialist phoneme because Americans and English can't pronounce it. But then I thought about the Dutch, and of course, that the theory falls apart because the Dutch have a lot of and they have a lot of imperial baggage to unpack. So another person who looked at this letter was a Russian poet, futurist poet called Khlebnikov. Khlebnikov was a little bit like the emo equivalent of Mayakovsky. You probably know Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky was really the jock of Russian futurism. Broad-shouldered, very good-looking. Khlebnikov was a guy in the corner doing weird things and like having hair in his eyes all the time, wearing black. Khlebnikov basically believed that Russia shouldn't look towards the West, which is very relevant today, unfortunately, geopolitically, that it should not look towards the West. So he even refused to use the term futurism because he said it's a Latin futur. So he used a Slavic equivalent, which is bududlyane, from budushi. So he believed that Russia should look to its Mongol, Persian, Turkic neighbors or heritage. And he also identified 40 words in Slavic languages that start with that have to do with shelter. Now, when you do forensic etymology, the things you're looking for are sky, shelter, sun, ground, essentially. Those are like the most important terms. And he found many terms that start with that have to do with shelter. He also believed in this very weird thing where he believed that, linguistics essentially has established, we've all accepted linguistic science from Saussure onwards, saying that there's no reason why, it's random why a letter follows another letter. So junk, there's no reason why junk, the U after the J, it happens to be like that. We find roots in other languages, maybe where it comes from, but there's no agency of the letters. Khlebnikov didn't believe in this. He believed that actually letters have a responsibility vis-a-vis other letters. So in a kind of spatial responsibility, it impacts what follows and what precedes it. A little bit like if you change a doorway from a hard door to a carpet or to a velvet door, impacts your understanding of the space afterwards, the threshold that you pass. So he used an example he called it the internal declension of words. So he used the Russian word khlam, which means junk. He said the L brings the sacredness of the ch down to junk and to rubbish, but if we use an R, it sort of elevates it. It's very much up to that kind of Rudolf Steiner, all those early experiments in language that was happening in their 20s. It's essentially the same time. So from khlam to khram becomes shrine all of a sudden. This is Khlebnikov. He was also a very important poet in the sense that he rhymed within the line. I'll read you the Russian, just so you get a sense. We didn't translate this. It's quite good English translation, but the Russian is even better. Nash kochin ochin azabochin, noj atochin tochin ochin. Which has been translated as, let us not be heads of lettuce, let us not let knives upset us. Another person sort of more recently who became famous, Notorious B.I.G., actually in the early days of B.I.G.'s rapping, he also who distinguished himself by rapping within the line as opposed to the end of the line. And I'll just play an excerpt for you here.
We used to fuck when the landlord dissed us. No heat, wonder why Christmas missed us. Birthdays was the worst days. Now we sit there paying when we birthdays.
So when we did an exhibition in the MoMA in 2012, we devoted it to this idea called Za'um. Chlebnikov's philosophy was called Za'um. Za'um literally means, Za is like trans or across, beyond. Is rationality, intelligence, wit in Russian. And all the translations we found for Za'um were really like very clunky, like a trans, rational. But I hate linguistics. For somebody who's so, I actually, the easiest way for me to fall asleep is if you give me a book about linguistics, like where do I put my tongue on the fricative or the alveolar, I'm out in like a second. I actually love philology because philology is not really linguistics in the sense that it's study of language through philosophy or through religion or through literature, but it's not the kind of clinical, white gloves approach to language, which I just find really deadly boring. We found one translation of Za'um, which was beyond sense. And I love this term because beyond sense has nonsense in it, which of course, like the kind of futurists and Dadaists he was interested in. But beyond sense also has Beyonce in it, which I'm sure the Chlebnikov would have very much approved of. I'm also from Houston, so that's a kind of hometown hero for us. Now, Chlebnikov was also considered, he was called the Russian dervish, not because he converted to Islam, but because he actually came down to the Persia in 1922 to support a very short-lived Soviet Socialist Republic on the Caspian Sea. And he just looked so bad when he arrived in 1920s. Like he was like 1922, I think his clothes were tattered and he was just so thin that they thought he's a dervish, like a kind of a mendicant who's like praying to God. And he actually died shortly after supporting this short-lived Soviet-supported republic. So when we did the exhibition at the MoMA, we had a kind of 7-meter wall of carpets. We had in front of the carpets what's called a kitab kebab. This kitab kebab is basically a book kebab. Why kebab, a series of books? Well, that's a good question. In some ways, when we start, we're also interested in the different organs of language. We always talk about the tongue, but I talked about the ch, of course, being the throat. We forget, because we overemphasize the kind of metonymic shorthand that, mother tongue, that we're using a certain, what tongues you speak in, but actually all the organs of language are equally erogenous and also equally important parts of language, whether it's the lips, the teeth, the throat. We're going to talk about nasals. I mean, nasals are also really interesting. For example, Slavic languages don't have nasals, but French, Polish have the nasals, the ow, and Turkish actually removed the nasal N that it used to have, which we'll talk about. But also, for me, the kebab is important because it really goes to this, in some ways, this anti-Enlightenment idea of knowledge. If you take the Enlightenment view of knowledge, it's cogito ergo sum because of Descartes. The focus has been so much for the past 500-600 years on our brain that we've forgotten about the other organs of knowledge. And of course, what is important today, and people are starting to understand with all the kind of TikTok videos of microbiomes and fermentation, but Chinese medicine and Ayurveda can tell you this for at least a couple hundred, if not thousands of years, is that this organ here is just as articulate as this organ, but we haven't studied it, so we don't really understand what language it speaks. In fact, the idea that this organ determines what happens in this organ has been totally overturned by even Western medicine. Now, people who study neurology in the West are asked to study gastroenterology because they finally come to the conclusion that, yes, the stomach is probably equally determinant of what happens here as this is determinant of what happens here. Now, inside was a kind of a fountain of 3 different chs prancing around a red fountain. But I will have to move a little bit faster because I want to get more into language, more different examples of transliteration. So Molla Nasruddin, we talked about him as a figure. He also happens to be the name of a very important, arguably the most important political satire of the 20th century in the Muslim world called Molla Nasruddin. It was published in Baku and Tbilisi. It was a satirical publication that had amazing illustrations like this, very liberal against sort of nationalism, against colonialism, also for women's rights. It was instrumental, for example, in the fact that Azerbaijan gave women the right to vote in 1918, which is far before most Western nations. Again, it complicates that perception of Muslim countries being necessarily against or somehow sort of anti-feminist. This is a typical, a great illustration of Molla Nasruddin. This is a Muslim man beating his wife. and the same man being beaten by his Russian lover. So it's sort of poking fun at the double standard that is being used towards Muslim women and towards Christian women, right? But I would say, other than its push for equal rights for women, the most important thing that Nasruddin did as a journal was it argued for the establishment of Azerbaijani as a literary official language. Until then, if you were in Azerbaijan, you published either in Russian or in Ottoman Turkish. And this was the first time that, so you have all these incredible illustrations of like the Azeri guy having his tongue cut off by Russian deputy members, and then a Russian tongue being sewn. Students, kids asking, why do I have to learn another tongue, meaning Russian, when I've got my own tongue? But if you look at if you dig a little bit deeper, what's incredible for us is on one page you have 3 different scripts. Mullah Nasruddin in the Arabic script, Mullah Nasruddin in the Cyrillic script, and then in Latin. On one page, 3 scripts, 1 language. So you have the full glory of like language, script changes in one page. Why? Because the Soviets, and in fact Trotsky and Lenin's idea was to modernize the Muslims of the Soviet Union, is to cut them off from the Arabic script and force them into Latin, because they'll be cut off from the Quran, and that'll like bring them into the 20th century. So all these Muslims, imagine a country like Azerbaijan, so imagine a country like Belgium, let's say. From one day to the next, 6 million people, you're going to read from, instead of reading from left to right, you're going to read from right to left. That happens, so they change to Latin. And then what happens, of course, is that in the interim, Ataturk has also changed the Turkish script to Latin. So Stalin freaks out that Turkey, right on the border, also has a Latin script, and all these mostly Turkic-speaking peoples have the same script. They're going to be mutually intelligible. So he changes it to Cyrillic. So again, bring out all your books, burn them all, keep reading left to right, but in Cyrillic instead of Latin. And then in 1991, many of these countries are going back to Latin from Cyrillic. Kazakhstan is going through it now. Azerbaijan already did it. Uzbekistan is also sort of halfway between. You have a situation where 3 generations can speak the same language. Imagine a grandmother, a daughter, and a granddaughter can speak the same language, but they can't read the same book because you become an immigrant within your own language, right? Because and imagine what kind of damage that does to kind of any sense of cultural legacy or kind of intellectual continuity. I will skip over this part. Let's go to some more British content. No, but jokes aside, this is like if you've been to an American college campus or Amsterdam, you've come across t-shirts like this, right? To beer or not to beer. There's even a dumber version, which is 2 beers or not to beer, 2 beers. What it's done is it's taken a relatively important existential question from Hamlet, no matter how pop cultural or cliche it's become, to be or not to be, and it's brought it down from a question of existential gravitas to a question of consumption. So Petra, if you want to drink a beer or don't drink a beer, go ahead, do it. It makes no difference. It's a question of consumption. The question is, how can I return that existential gravitas to the equation of to be or not to be that it had lost from going from to be or not to be? Well, one way to do that is to write it in the Arabic script, because Arabic being the holy script of Islam, for me, as a Muslim, to drink a beer or not to drink a beer is not just a question of consumption, right? It's a question of belonging. It's a question of identity. Am I a Muslim or am I not? Do I belong or do I not belong? So it gathers that existential gravitas again. Now, I don't know how much you're familiar with German history. I had to familiarize myself 10 years ago when we moved to Germany. My background was always French and Russian. I kind of missed this thing in the middle called Germany. Just never studied the history, never studied the language, and now I'm kind of catching up in my late 40s. But the Germans were late to the imperial game, late to imperialism. Their hands are not clean. They have some pretty terrible things to answer for. I'm not even talking about Second World War. I'm talking about actual colonialism in West Africa. But long story short, the Germans only start to, because of the late arrival of the unification of Germany as a nation state, they only start to kind of go into the colonial race in the late 19th century. Kaiser Wilhelm in 1898 goes to the sacred lands of Jerusalem and goes to Syria, and he visits the grave of Saladin. Saladin being this kind of, Arabic fighter who was considered to be kind of a hero to the West because He pardoned many people that he caught and was very merciful towards his captives. And he sees this tomb of Saladin, and he finds it too shabby. So he says, I'm going to bring a much nicer, he deserves a better tomb. So he brings this marble tomb. And if you go to the Umayyad Mosque, hopefully one day you can travel to Damascus, and if you go inside to see Saladin, you have this very strange situation where you have two graves. Of course, the Ottomans, they said, sure, we'll take the gift, but they don't change where Saladin is buried. So you go there, and it says, the true grave for the virtuous body of Saladin, al-Ayyubi, and then this is the gift that Kaiser Wilhelm gave us, but we didn't put him in there, you know? So you have this kind of doubling of the tomb of Saladin. And it's part of a plan that later becomes activated, and basically Kaiser Wilhelm raises a glass of wine and salutes the 300 million Muslims in the world at the time. He says, look, Germany's on your side. He's being very realpolitik, cynical about it. Why? Because all the Muslims at the time were under the empires of Germany's rivals, under France, Russia, and England. So he says, rise up, Muslims of the world, we, Germany, will support you. Fast forward 15 years, during the First World War, and the Germans with the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans, they declare a jihad against the Entente powers. So it's kind of partial jihad, right? It's a jihad on behalf of some infidels, but against other infidels. So it's against France, England, and who's the other person? Italy? Yeah, France, England, Russia, Italy. France, England, Russia, but on behalf of the Austro-Hungarians, etc. And what they do in this jihad, during this jihad, is they actually build the first functioning mosque on German soil. It's a showpiece. It's a mosque for the prisoners of war, of Muslim prisoners of war that the Germans capture. And they build an incredible mosque. They give them halal food. They have games for them because they're trying to convince them that, look, this is how we treat our Muslim prisoners of war. This is how much Germany's on the side of Muslims. Again, rise up, Germany. To my knowledge, it's the first example of a Western nation instrumentalizing political Islam that we've seen over the 20th century, all the way through the Taliban being supported by the West, to recently Daesh and ISIS being supported by the West against Assad. But this, I think, is the first example. And the most curious piece of this puzzle is that they even published a newsletter called El Jihad. The German government published a newsletter called El Jihad, in sort of exhorting the Muslims of the world in their languages, so in 4 different languages, in Turkish, in Arabic, this is the Arabic edition, Arabische Ausgabe, in Russian, Ciel Gazeti, Russische Ausgabe, and then Urdu. And of course, being the kind of transliteration alphabet aficionados that we are, the first thing that I look at, I'm just like, this is jihad in Arabic, j. Look how they write jihad in German. D-S-C-H. 4 letters for one phoneme, j. Why? The irony is there's no j in German. So they had to create the j, right? And they decided with a kind of mouthful of letters, 4 letters. So immediately I thought, can I look at, like, what's the equivalent of the German Oxford English Dictionary? It's called the Duden. Can I look in this? What are the other words in German that start with a D-S-C-H? And I shit you not, it is a greatest hits of Orientalist terms. This is some of them. My favorite is, of course, Dschungelfieber, here on the bottom, because Germans definitely suffer from Dschungelfieber. Genghis Khan, with jihad we just discussed. Djibouti, the city. Jalaba, the North African garment. Jadidismus, the movement. Now, so just indulge me here for a second. When you go to a bar in Berlin and you order a gin and tonic, the gin and tonic is not written gin and tonic D-S-C-H, right? Or when you go buy, I don't know, jeans at the store, jeans in German is not written D-S-C-H. It's written with a J, a J, or a G for gin and tonic. There's a lot of words in German that have become German with a sound phoneme J that don't have D-S-C-H. I can list some of them. Gentrifizierung, gentrification. Jazz, Jogging-Schuhe. None of these are written with D-S-C-H. So in some ways, you could say it's the German alphabet's conscious or unconscious way to mark terms as ours or other. This is a kind of way of othering, jogging shoe, jazz, gentrification are ours, but Dschungelfieber, Genghis Khan, Jeddah, jihad are not ours. So we mark it with a D-S-C-H. Now immediately when the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and the Turks declare jihad, the English answer at the time by saying this is a jihad made in Germany. Now again, I can think of a lot of ways to discredit something, but made in Germany is not the first thing that comes to my mind. Because when I think of a jihad made in Germany, I think of a very highly engineered jihad that costs a little bit more than a normal jihad, but will last you a lot longer, you know? Made in Germany doesn't sound like a bad jihad to me. You know, I'd take a made in Germany jihad over like a, let's say, made elsewhere jihad. Now, of course, what the English were saying was that this is not an authentic jihad. It has no credibility because it was not thought up in the Arabian Peninsula or in Baghdad or etc., but it was thought up in Berlin. Now, we'll end with the most successful example of alphabet conversion in the world, which is really Turkish alphabet politics. It's really, it's the Oscars of alphabet changes. Because what's amazing about Turkey is it's only about 100 years old, this alphabet changes, and nobody disputes it. Like even the most batshit crazy Salafist, Islamist, nobody's arguing Turkey to come back to the Arabic alphabet. It's a done deal. And that's pretty impressive for something which is relatively recent. It's only 100 years old. Ataturk decides to change the alphabet of Turkey from Arabic script, Ottoman Turkish, to Latin. Of course, there's ideological reasons to change any alphabet. But to be fair to Ataturk and to Turks, there's also real reasons to change because Turkish has 8 vowels, 9 vowels. I don't know. Arabic only has 3. And these weird vowels that look like German vowels in Turkish, the ö and the ü, there's no Arabic way to mark an ö and an ü. It's a bit like the French, the au-dessus, au-dessous. There's no way to write this in Arabic. Actually, Uyghurs have found a way to do it, but it's also considered to be kind of non-conventional. But anyway, to be fair, Ataturk says he believes that the Latin is the script of the West, and he wants to hitch his ride onto the West because the West is more advanced, and the Ottoman Empire was a sick man of Europe, etc. But it was fair because there were real linguistic reasons to do so as well. However, when you change an alphabet, you also lose sounds. One of the sounds that Turkish lost was this nasal N. Turkish used to have 2 N's. Turkish used to have an N which is like Niyahat, normal N, Nantes in France, never, Nottingham. But then it had another N which sounds like this, Try pronouncing It's your nose doing the Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that also for me sounds very, I hate to say this, but it sounds very Eastern. Why? Because there's people, I think there's millions of people in China named NG, right? Right? In Cantonese, right? And Cantonese has the NG. So I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but is it in becoming Western that he ditched the most Eastern sounding phoneme of the Turkish alphabet? Because a lot of Turkish words that you and I might know, if you know any words in Turkish, you've been on holiday even, deniz, sea, tanri, the word for the pre-Islamic word for the kind of Genghis Khan era word for great sky, the shamanistic word for God, it used to be deniz, and it used to be tangri, and they've removed this N, has slowly has fallen. And actually, the more you go east to Turkic languages, Uzbek, Kazakh, they still have this but Turkey has lost it. And it was written like this, a kef, for those of you who can read Arabic, it's a K with 3 dots. Now, finally, when we're doing research for this cycle of work, we were working with a professor at the Bilkent University in Ankara, İlker Aytürk, and he was doing comparative studies of Hebrew and Turkish. And he said, because he wanted to understand, there were actually attempts to Latinize Hebrew. If you're familiar with the history of Hebrew, Hebrew until the 20th century was a liturgical religious language. Hebrew was not used as an everyday secular language until the creation of Israel, until the early Zionists resuscitated Hebrew or recuperated Hebrew as a secular language. Why? Because most of the Zionists were European Jews who were using Latin alphabets, right? And so there was a debate, why should we distinguish? Let's keep the original Hebrew, this Hebrew, the kind of the square letter Hebrew, for the Torah and for religious study, but let's have Hebrew and Latin for our everyday use. And that didn't happen, and Aytürk, the professor, he did a kind of comparative study of why certain alphabet changes work and others don't, the kind of criteria. And one of the criterion that helps is you have to have an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the script you're changing to. Turks had this inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West, and European Jews didn't have this inferiority complex because it was already their alphabet, And they actually looked up to the Hebrew because it was kind of for obvious reasons, it was a holy script. Second, of course, it helps to have very low literacy rates. Turkish literacy, I mean, to be also fair to Turkey, is the literacy rate of Turkey went through the roof with these alphabet changes. Turkish was very difficult to write in Ottoman Turkish, in Ottoman script, and it was only, I think, about a 8% literacy rate in the early 20s. Among Zionists in Palestine at the time, there was maybe 25%. It's much harder to change 25% of your population than 8%. I'll end with a quote by Marshall McLuhan, who talks about the Greek myth about the alphabet, was that Cadmus, reputedly the king who introduced the phonetic letters into Greece, sowed the dragon's teeth, and they sprang up as armed men. Languages are filled with testimony to the grasping, devouring power and precision of teeth. That the power of letters as agents of aggressive order and precision should be expressed as the extension of the dragon's teeth is natural and fitting. Letters are not only like teeth visually, but their power to put teeth into the business of empire building is manifest in our Western history. Thank you very much.
Well, great to see many new and familiar faces tonight. Very diverse audience. First of all, thank you very much, Payam. Little do you know, Payam got on a 5 a.m. flight this morning, or 6 a.m. from Berlin, and arriving 7:30 UK time. Yeah. So, you've got a lot of energy. I can tell. Through this lecture performance. Before we delve deeper into the conversation, just out of curiosity, among our audience tonight, how many of you speak more than one language? If you raise your hand. Brilliant. And how many of you read and write more than one language? Oh, about the same. Wow, that's almost like half or more than half of the room. Impressive. So when Paya suggested so you have quite a few series of lecture performance, but kind of aligning with our summer program, from counter archives to activation. Then Payam suggested, what about transliterate tease? And I thought, that's a brilliant suggestion, and I immediately sort of connected to the city of Manchester. So here, there are more than 150 spoken languages. I think some of the languages you mentioned, like Arabic, Polish, Persian, they're among some of the most spoken languages here. And also, according to the 2021 census, 32% of the population in Manchester were born outside of the UK. So it's truly an international city. And here at EC Contemporary, I think what's quite critical also for us is to consider the role of multiplicity and polyphony, and how that runs through not just our program, but also in the sense of community building. I suppose as a co-founder of a collective that's very known for your multicultural approach, and especially I think in terms of this particular subject, would you like to share any strategy, when it comes to like a multicultural community building? Because obviously in our everyday life and also through the door of our institution, very often people don't feel confident, to speak the language to grow up with. Especially, I think in some of your other works, you also touched upon the fact transgenerational, right? Like language. For example, grandma, mother, daughter, they speak the same language, but they can't read the same language, right? Is there some strategy behind all of those research you would like to share with us?
I mean, I don't think there's a strategy per se, but I mean, maybe in retrospect, I could say this strategy, but it was never premeditated or calculated. I am very proud of the fact that we have a lot of work that is in different languages, and that's not easy to do because they're not, anybody who's ever translated understands that it's translating, especially translating humor or translating sort of word plays, is very, very difficult to do. And I'm proud of it, not because we're able to do it, but because I believe that as art institutions, are being called to be more accountable to different publics, different demographies, right? The traditional Western bourgeois demographic is no longer sustainable for most institutions in terms of numbers, in terms of viability of the institution. Institutions are having trouble making different audiences feel comfortable within their spaces. And I don't think actually it's so difficult. One way is if you just see your script in a space, it already makes you feel welcome. But there's also ways, people talk so much about sort of decentering and decolonizing nowadays. We don't actually use those terms because I'm not interested in articulating ideas of decolonialism. I'm actually much more interested in action, like what our work does as decolonialism, as opposed to talking about it. But if you simply put like an iron machine in a space in a German art institution, that already has a certain significance because traditionally the Turkish audience in Germany doesn't feel welcome in these famous Kunsthallen. And it's not because Turks are not educated or they're not interested or they're not socioeconomically affluent enough. It's simply because, to use horrible terms, like the touch points or the things that they see in spaces are like, they haven't been necessarily welcoming. And I think that part of that for us is language, part of it is materiality. Let's say craft uses or even just vernacular things like an iron machine or carpets, it's not premeditated. It's actually very sincere in the sense that we just like these things as well, but it also happens to make audiences feel welcome. And I've noticed that because museums never said this in the past, but now they've started to explicitly articulate it when they invite us. They say, we want to activate the X minority in our neighborhood. Like the Muslims in Philadelphia, the Russian-speaking people in, the Ukrainian, Belarus, Russian in this city. And it's language helps. At the same time, if I'm perfectly honest, language also, I think our best works are works that don't have language. Because as soon as you use any language, you're obviously cutting off a lot of people from that work. So it's a kind of double-edged sword, using language, not only using language, any text whatsoever, but using plays within that language. That's even, you're kind of narrowing your audience, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Then of course that also leads to like the fancy cousin of transliteration, translation, right? Like, so at Easy Contemporary, we try to provide bilingual or multilingual text materials whenever appropriate and whenever we can. But at the same time, it's also kind of the sensitivity and the nuance of it. I guess my next question will have to do with maybe this most obvious question. You probably have been asked a million times, but I feel like since you haven't been asked that question in Manchester, so it's still sort of the first time, which is why Eurasia? Why Eurasia? I feel like this question is also relevant to our practice because when people look at our brand, Easy Contemporary, even though all in lowercase, but in many other organizations, they tend to use the capital letter ESEA, right, abbreviation for East and Southeast Asia. So again, it's like double-sided sword. Some people may consider, because this center used to be a Chinese art center, so it's Chinese only, so now you have widened your scope, but at the same time, is it another form of territorialism? Are you cutting off, those other countries who are just outside? But actually, it's totally not the way we're working. I would like to maybe mention a quote from a previous interview you did. We believe it is in the margins of ideologies, the edges of empires, where one finds the most fertile progressive syncretism, not at the rotten core. So I feel like maybe there's something about establishing the territory, but not about an identity, but maybe an identity in collapse or an identity in search. Would you like to share a bit about that?
Yeah, to be honest, as we all have seen, the appropriation of identity politics of the left by the right in the past decade or so or longer is I think it's time that all of us stop talking about identity politics, full stop, like just move beyond it. I think, to be honest, I think our best work that we've done in 18 years is our name on it. I think Slavn Tatar is a really great name, and the reason why is that regionalism is a way to move beyond the nationalism. Even the idea like today, I think when people are described of this person is a British Pakistani artist, this person is an American Chinese artist, I find that so boring in the 19th century. Like, are you really? I was born in Texas. I'm Iranian, parents, but I speak Russian and read Russian better than I speak Persian. I've lived more in Russia than I've lived in Iran. So am I more Iranian? Why, this idea that you have to study or you have to be devoted to what you're born to, which is, it's a question, it's actually a leftist requirement increasingly on us, right? This question of credibility.
Yeah.
One way to combat that is regionalism, as you said. With the whole region, with Slavs and Tatars is this Great Wall of China, Berlin Wall, it's such a massive region that immediately shows that you cannot be an expert, obviously, that it's I don't know, 300 different languages, I don't know how many different ethnicities, so to even claim to have any power or territorialism over such a massive region was deliberate. It's almost absurd. Another way to combat, for me, rising nationalism is language groups. I'm actually not interested in Turkey, I'm interested in the Turkic languages. Because when I talk about Turkic languages, all of a sudden I have basically like kind of Bulgarian all the way to Uyghur, Kyrgyz, Azeri, Dagestani, and then that's for me much more interesting. I'm not interested in Turkey, I'm not interested in Iran, I'm interested in Persianate languages. And I think that, that's one way to kind of just, it's a personal discipline to just not, we talked about it during lunch, not to be interested in one's own origin, or not to be interested in one's own origin as a kind of single origin. I don't believe that we are one, we are multiple people within ourselves. And there's a great quote by Hamid Dabashi, the Iranian scholar, who says that every home has its abroad. This idea that cosmopolitanism and internationalism is something of like sophisticated people in New York or London or Paris is nonsense. The Baluch in Iran speaks 4 languages, speaks Arabic, Baluch, Persian, sometimes Pashto, so why are they not a cosmopolitan, And I think that one way, so for me it's the regionalism is one way to realistically overcome nationalism. I mean, we can say, oh, I'm a citizen of the world, nonsense, but that's just, bullshit. And you can't hang your hat on it, but you can hang your hat on a region. Your region, okay, it has edges, our region has edges, but it doesn't mean that, do we not deal with the Middle East at all? No, if it's relevant, of course. You cannot talk about Eurasia without the rise of Islam pushing from the Arabian Peninsula into Eurasia. In the same way that I cannot talk, is China part of our region or not? Is China Eurasia? Yes, obviously it is, but it's not strictly within those walls, let's say.
So then, for you, does Eurasia remain elusive and indecipherable, and it has never been the goal to claim the expertise or
the opposite? I would say is that, to be perfectly frank, I'm not a Slav and I'm not a Tatar. So in today's, and this is the kind of the dangerous path that identity politics has put us on, is that there's increasingly credible voices from colleagues of mine that also say that you should not be able to call yourself Slav and Tatars because you're not Slav and you're not Tatar.
I face that question a lot because people know that I was born and raised in Shanghai, so in mainland China. And then, I got this question quite often, just like, so how many kind of East and Southeast Asian, cultural influences are within you? But I'm a single person, I've been living many different places and speak a couple of languages, but I would never, claim, I think it's the same with institution. We don't, when we restructure our team, as some of you may know, 2 years ago, I arrived in Manchester. We did a whole revision of this organization, revitalized it. When we go through different rounds of recruitment, we don't look at the DNA of people and then try to decipher. So how many percentage of China do we need? How many percentage, of Thailand, Vietnam, of Cambodian, and also people are much more complex than that, right? So among our colleagues, we have, one colleague born in Macau but speaks Cantonese, but actually grew up in Wakefield. We have a colleague, born in Malaysia and then grew up in Singapore, etc., and etc. So there's influence, multiculturalism, that kind of it's not just like something that runs through us, but it's also very much a live practice. And also through engagements with the arts community, with our wider community, we are so informed, and there's so many opportunities for new learning every day. Like I feel today, I'm a different person, from yesterday in a sense, right? Yeah.
I think it's also, there's a kind of, human nature is the older you get, your sphere, if you want to talk about yourself as a nation or as an empire, your sphere of influence gets narrower. You know where you like to summer, you know where you like to have dinner, you know where you like to have lunch, and you're kind of, the French would call it sort of refinement, raffinement, right? So you're, again, you get older and you have this much of a sphere of influence. And actually the challenge, I believe, as an artist, as a human being, is to actually go like this. It's hard. So it means that the older you get, the more you take risks, as opposed to taking less and less risks. But it also means that this, it means devoting yourself to things that you're not comfortable with. And Slavs and Tatars was actually founded in some ways, I very much felt I was in my, I guess, late 20s, that the kind of the intellectual path of most art, the art world is extremely insular. The references that, if you look at any art publication, we're all talking about the same people in the effluxes and all these, the Rancières and the Agambins and this, and I just find this deadly boring. Like, I am interested in, not that I'm interested in those authors, I've read them, but I would never, none of our books you'll find any of these authors mentioned. I love reading books where, like, I look at the bibliography or the names and the footnotes and I'm like, who are they? I've never heard of these people in my life. That's what I want to learn in life. And so, in some ways, Slav and Tatars was actually founded for us to devote ourselves to things we do not know. And again, as opposed to kind of sort of embracing your antithesis or embracing things which are far away from you. I think we overemphasize or we over prioritize things that we tend to gravitate towards things we already like. And we can see in social media, algorithms feed us people we already agree with, writers we like. For me, it's a dead end. It's a kind of intellectual dead end, is that we have to engage and we have to actually be friends also. I think it's important is just on a social level also to be friends with people that you find uncomfortable and weird and not necessarily like you. I don't want to be friends with people who are like me. That's deadly boring. And even within Slav and Tatars, you couldn't find more different people amongst us. We have absolutely different profiles. We do different things. I'm not even allowed to go to an installation exhibition because I will just stress everybody out. I'm useless. Like, there's other people who know how to make works. There's other people who know how to install them. But I'm like a typical Middle Eastern man. I talk a lot and I don't know how to do anything else with my hands, So
you're in charge of the lecture performance
and people,
department.
and then of course it feeds into people's stereotypes. They say, oh, why is Payam the man always talking? Where is the woman in Slav and Tatars? Well, you're very welcome to speak to the woman. She will chop your head off if you ask her to speak publicly. She doesn't want to speak publicly. But there's no reason for us to hew to the conventions of society which says that the woman should be visible. Well, if the woman doesn't want to be visible,
the work is very much visible.
She's very strong, she definitely runs the show. Yeah. But does she have to be actually there and exposed if she doesn't want to be? Well, that's up to her. It's not nobody's choosing that for her. But of course, it plays into certain stereotypes that people want to have. He's a man. He's a Middle Eastern man. Why is he? It's stupid, but people project. It must be oppressing. There must be like a woman in the background. This person is not in the backdrop. And so there's this kind of. It's important to kind of engage with these problematic ideas, or even, I'm not saying that we should be friends with people who are aggressive toward us or harmful, but it's very important to be exposed to ideas that we find uncomfortable.
And remain curious, right?
Absolutely.
Remain curious. And I also hear kind of in the backdrop of what you were just saying, so this word like courage, emerged, because I think nowadays, especially in the art world, in the cultural terrain, sometimes we find those like barriers. Maybe it's like self-constructed barriers, out of fear of saying something that could offend someone. But sometimes it's also because we simply lack that particular knowledge. What if we educate ourselves first? Nowadays, especially we live in the free world here, it's so easy to access knowledge, easier than ever. Why don't we educate ourselves first, then trust our own judgment? This thing I'm dying to say, do I trust myself? Because I've already done my homework. If I've not even done my homework, just, that I think that's not quite okay. But then if I've done my homework and I feel like this is something I, as a person, I would like to express, it might create certain risk, but I have to be kind of okay with that risk, right? And to a certain degree, especially if we have already chosen to work in the arts, which is supposed to be the most liberal and transcending, right, realm of creation.
I mean, you saw in tonight's lectures that humor is very important for us. Humor always engages risk. I'm very proud of the fact that we've never scandalize or antagonize any group or any majority or minority, any ethnic group, any religious group ever, despite dealing with humor about what some people would consider sensitive subject matter. Now, you would imagine that after doing this for 18 years, it would be easier and easier to do that. Actually, it's harder and harder for us to do what we do because until about 5 or 6 years ago, institutions trusted us. They didn't understand what the hell we're talking about. But they're like, okay, they get it. They know what they're talking about. They're not going to attack it. They've never had any problems in the past. They're very sensitive. They speak the language. It's actually getting more and more difficult because institutions are becoming more and more afraid to even take that little step of trusting the artist. Humor can be incredibly inclusive. Our humor is inclusive. Our humor is really not exclusive. It's never at the expense of anybody. But even that is considered to be somehow problematic in today's sort of very virtuous age, that there's a kind of belief in the art world somehow that if your work is serious, it should look serious. Or if it's light, then it can be light and sort of fun. But if it's serious, it should look serious and solemn, and the way it's lit and the way it's talked about. And God forbid you try to mix those, because that's considered to be kind of very dangerous, you know. And I don't believe that's dangerous. I think that's.
But you're very much a mixer, you know. Not just the
We
serious
try.
and the light and the lightness, but also like high and lowbrow cultural, right? And it kind of also leads me to think about hospitality, you know, like I think also throughout Slavs and Tatars' work, like translation, is that a quote or a statement? Like translation is a form of linguistic hospitality.
That's Paul Ricoeur, actually, who taught Macron, the philosopher. He actually talks about translation as a form of linguistic Abrahamic hospitality, that you're inviting the foreigner into your language and you're expatriating yourself into the language of the foreigner. A little bit like inviting the foreigner into your house. And in that sense, in that equation, then transliteration becomes a kind of linguistic transvestism, right? Even the word transvestism, you know, this lecture performance used to be called Transliterative Tease, and it was somebody online who from the LGBTQ community in Germany who wrote, of course, an English speaking, like I don't want to say an Englishman, but it was not a German. It was a kind of, and the reason I mention this is that they said, you know, tranny is a pejorative term. Well, actually, that's also contested, because tranny is a term that many in the transvestite community find to be a term which is celebratory. But it's this importation of political correctness, which I'm not against. I think that it should just be tailored to the languages or to the setting. So in the same way that race, you know, that I believe that Black Lives Matter was an incredibly important movement, it was imported from an Anglo-American model into countries that have different race relations. And so it should be hybridized, right? And so transliteration is to even, you know, use the term transvestism today is considered to be kind of a passé term by some people, but it's contested. It's just it's a term which is not, it's not an aggressive term, obviously.
Yeah, that's really incredibly insightful. I do want to also mention, because I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but Slavs and Tatars started as a book club, right? And then you started making publications, you know, so you published already 12 books. But then in recent years, since 2020, you've also kind of expanded to institution making. So we're talking about institutions. You also have a space institution in Berlin, and it's a very alive and, if I may say, trendy, you know, every event I have ever been at the Pickle Bar is just the most cool, but also intellectual, but also engaging and very, very exciting. You know, there are exhibitions, performances, different sort of engagements, with the community and arts community. So what do you see beyond that? Is that something you plan in the future?
To be honest, the institution building also was not planned as such. It came from a very organic. We got to a point where, knock on wood, we had the privilege of having more invitations and more desire to work with us, more than we can handle. Now, I don't know how many, I don't think there's 100 ways you can deal with this as an artist. Most artists would think vertically and say, okay, let me just make more expensive works. So instead of making work with like steel, I'll make work with silver, and then I'll just cost, you know, it'll cost that much more. That never interested us intellectually. Also, our market couldn't handle that. So it doesn't make any sense for me. It also doesn't interest me, but even if it did interest me, it wouldn't make sense financially. So the question is, how can you divert those funds and to other things? And part of that was the residency and mentorship program. So we have a residency for young professionals from our region, and the pickle bar happened at the same time. And it's fantastic because it allowed us to reclaim the anonymity of Slavs and Tatars. It's sad in a sense to what extent as humans we're so conditioned to think in individual personalities. Even when you have a collective, people really wanted it at some point. Oh, we want you, Kasha, to come here and do this. We want you, Payam. We want you, Stan, to do this. And I just thought this is really, again, boring. Is that the reason we have a collective is so that we're not bound to our personal personalities. Where did you study? Where are you from? Blah blah blah. And now, in some ways, because of this other initiatives of Pickle Bar and others, we've somehow claimed that Slav and Tatars as a platform again. So people don't think of us as a personalities as much as there's no reason why other people can't publish books with us Slavs and Tatars. There's no reason why people can't do lectures that we can host. There's no reason why in Pickle Bar we never perform. We're kind of the MCs for other artists.
And then you also don't curate everything, right? You actually don't.
I mean,
like,
we at Slav and Tatar strictly
yeah.
now, actually, for a year now, Pickle Bar is a separate NGO, like what we call it, a non-profit.
Yeah.
It's a separate legal structure. We are not even involved. Anastasia and Patricia are running it. But it's also allowed us, and this was not the intention, but now when institutions talk to us, when they don't have this. I was always uncomfortable with the kind of infantilizing tone that institutions have towards artists, like. How was your train ride? I know it comes from a good place.
I'm sorry, I asked you. That was my first question this morning.
No, but it's like, but it's something perverse. As an artist, it's very unhealthy psychologically. They say, how's your hotel? How's your flight? How was lunch? Can I, and in the end, you're not paid for what you're doing to live off of it, right? So you're treated like a kid, and it's not saying, again, it's not calculated, it's not sinister, but it's psychologically fundamentally unhealthy because it infantilizes you. And now when institutions talk to us, they don't, oh, what are you working on? It's much more like we're on equal level. The institution's like, well, how can we help each other?
Yeah.
And that's thanks to actually the things like the Pickle Bar and the residency. I think the institutions finally understood that all these other things that we're doing, they always thought it's a kind of like, the sad way that people think of it's the kind of added on media, like, oh, you have an exhibition, let's just add on a lecture, let's just add on a book. But art actually only represents, with a capital A, 40, 50% of what we do. And they now acknowledge that those are really equally valid initiatives as the exhibition or the art with the kind of thing that exists materially. And that's been nice to see, I have to say.
What do you feel like the Pickle Bar is doing, like, what are the most right things, it's doing that you feel like, oh,
right wing? No, I'm just
right things.
Hopefully
white
nothing.
wings, chicken wings. And what are the things you're still trying to kind of learn?
I mean, Pickle Bar is it's still very precarious. I mean, you said we live in free societies. I don't want to say that. I don't want to be kind of a whataboutism. I'm very grateful for the incredible public support that we have in Germany. But as you know, recently with that public support comes certain strings attached. It's dangerous. It worries me that we're so dependent. Like, I don't want to sound like a businessman, but unfortunately, I believe to be a successful artist nowadays, other than being a painter, you have to be a little bit entrepreneurial. It's just a reality.
I spent all my days looking at spreadsheets.
You're not the only one, unfortunately. So, and Slavs and Tatars has different revenue streams that kind of protect us. Pickle Bar at the moment doesn't, and it's very dependent on public funding in Germany and a little bit elsewhere. But that worries me. So I would like it to be. I mean, we're working on it to kind of just for it to be something that can survive. God forbid, the way that things are going in Germany with the rise of the far right, with budgets being cut, it's going to be harder and harder to defend the gravy years of the last 20 years in Germany. That's done. That's not going to come back ever. So we have to be a bit careful about how we.
Yeah, and we need to adapt.
I mean,
and
maybe you guys can teach us things, as you guys have been already there for the past 10 years. Sorry, no offense, but.
Well, here's to the spreadsheets. But so finally, I don't know if I will be able to come up with a question, but I do really want to talk about it briefly. So it's kind of coming back to a full circle about Mullah Nasruddin. So as you mentioned, this character kind of half historical, half like a mythical or fictional, exists in many different cultures, right? And then So in the case of China, so in Xinjiang province, and there's this figure, this actually deriving from the same character, but that character's name is Afanti. So I grew up in the 80s, and in the early 80s, the Shanghai Animation Film Studio, they made a quite groundbreaking colored puppet film. It's a series of 12 episodes, and the title is called The Story of Afanti. However, that character is depicted quite differently, from this version. So basically, this Afanti, there's nothing silly about him. There's not so much irony. He's just kind of like a folklore, like a superhero kind of person, So like he's witty, he's smart, he's like
a trickster.
And the most important thing is that he helps the oppressed.
Yes.
Yeah, he helps the oppressed against corrupt officials, the king, or landlords, etc. So every single episode is like a self-sustained plot. It's always about Afanti helping people, but in a very smart, witty, also humorous way. And he also rides the donkey, the wrong way. So that's the similarity. I just feel like growing up, that was probably because that show was really popular. I'm sure here maybe some of you would, if you're from China, you're from similar, you would have seen it. And then growing up, I definitely recall Afanti was probably the first like pop cultural figure that I got familiar with. Who's also from an ethnic minority background, because most of the human characters you would see, especially in children's story, would be like from like the Han, Chinese background. But then, of course, as I grew up and gained further knowledge, and just looking back, also kind of realizing the geopolitical narratives around that, it was because that show was created just a couple years post the Cultural Revolution, So nowadays, if I watch it again, I definitely can see, kind of the emphasis on the class struggle and the very black and white, good versus evil. But then, nowadays, I think many of the like new cartoons or animations in China, they have advanced a lot, but they don't really touch upon the issue of class anymore, because now we're facing different issues. But just something I wanted to mention, because I do feel like maybe also the audience would also agree among all those multiple and numerous cultural references you mentioned. I feel like everyone can find something very close to home in it, right? And then kind of really inspires us to find the interconnectedness. Not just when we visit a gallery, institution, when we read a book, publication, but hopefully can be transcended, to our everyday, experiences, with people surrounding us, with the community.
I mean, Nasruddin is a really fascinating character because, like you said, he's been instrumentalized by different, so the Soviets also used him because he was an sort of a folk hero, so against the kind of rich classes and stuff. And today you find books of him all over Turkey, but he's been whitewashed. Actually, originally Nasruddin apparently had a lot of very, very dirty sexual jokes, which have been totally removed from the record, so you don't find them in Iran or in Turkey because they're kind of not kosher in sort of Muslim countries, to use the wrong term, to have these kind of sexual, quite both sexual and in a kind of quite fluid sense of sexuality, and these are very hard to come across. Actually, the original ones. So and actually, Afanti comes from the Turkish, from Effendi. So the Chinese Nasruddin is called Afanti from the Turkish Effendi. Yeah.
Oh yes, because I also read a bit on that. So the director and art designer for that particular series, they went to different regions, not just in Xinjiang, but actually also in Central Asia for their research. But then eventually decided on kind of depicting this popularized character from Xinjiang, from the Uyghur culture, actually. So, yeah. All right, great. I think I've asked all my questions. Maybe not all, but at least for this session, because I hope that maybe some audience would like to take this opportunity to ask a couple of questions, if there's any from our audience today.
Can I ask a question? Hello, my name is Julia. Thank you so much for the fascinating performative lecture. My question is more related about the future of language and technology. I wonder, how do you envision artificial intelligence and large language model transforming the way we approach transliteration and cross-cultural communication? Thanks.
That's a very good question. Maybe you can help me answer it yourself. I'm a little bit older than I look, so I don't know how to use all these new tools, to be honest. I'm suspicious about language learning tools.
Why?
Because, again, it shows my age. I feel like a crusty old person talking like this, but I think about like how language immersion, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when I learned my first language, there was no, even to call it back home, you had to dial 10 digits on the public phone, right? I wonder today how people immerse themselves because, of course, they're still on their phone and they go to another country. There's no, is it possible to be fully immersed in another language like we were 20, 30 years ago? In France, 25 years ago, nobody spoke English in rural France. Nobody spoke English in the late 90s in Russia when I was there, and there was no internet, so there's no way for me to access another language. So I don't know, I mean, the idea that you don't have to learn languages, you know, that language, a lot of language departments in Western institutions or academic institutions are being defunded. You know, it's considered a kind of a larger trend of like humanities are useless, only STEM, but also it goes hand in hand with a kind of, unfortunately, kind of a military-industrial complex. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically, when I was learning Russian in the late 90s in the States, Russian departments were starting to fire professors because the US considered that it had won the Cold War, so there's no need to learn Russian anymore. And actually nowadays, Polish as well is considered to be slowly dying in departments in the United States because the US, and I don't know how England is like this, but the US considers Poland is now a Western country, so it's kind of in the right category, so it doesn't need to learn it anymore, you know? And so I don't know if language learning, if kind of, let's say, technology is only accelerating this. It seems like it's accelerating this trend of the need not to actually for humans to learn, because everything that we looked about today is actually the wrong way of learning, right? I mean, transliteration is all about the wrong, there's no right way. You know, the guy who decided to do a homoerotic transliteration of the Iliad, I mean, I would love to get to a point where technology decides to do that kind of thing. I think we're very far away from it. And so I'm interested in, again, the kind of the hiccups in language. And I don't, maybe that's maybe somewhere that I'm not saying that technology can't do that. I'm sure technology is already doing it, but I don't know where to look for it, you know, I'm not interested in the positivism of technology. I don't believe that technology will solve issues. It's more about what it highlights that we didn't think about, you know, or kind of the glitches in some sense, in that sense. But maybe it was not just a rhetorical, maybe you can tell us a bit yourself.
Oh, no, just, I've been thinking just two ways. So maybe one way is can be a very useful tool for people to learn like language, but also it can maybe also create another wall, just trap people inside their own domain so they can only understand, because it's all about translation. So if you only understand the world but through your own language, the language you use the most, then you kind of like just kick yourself into this domain. But I still believe there's a third zone somewhere. Yeah. So that's why. I mean,
goes again to the question of identity politics that language helps us get out of. I fundamentally believe, and I'm dead serious in this, and I actually believe the closest thing to a superpower we can have as humans is to speak another language fluently. It's like you have a different sense of humor in a different language, and if you are a different person. You're a different person.
We're able to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's maybe not PC to talk, but it's a bit like role playing. You can be different people. It's a kind of productive schizophrenia. It's a superpower to be able to go into a place and pass as something. Again, and this is something that today is considered to be wrong to say to pass as, but I don't think that's wrong. I think that's about the fluidity of who we are as humans. That, you know, if I wear a hat like this, people will walk on the street in Chicago and say salam alaikum, but I'm actually wearing it because I'm losing my hair, so it's purely vain, you know? And people think that I'm hard, even though I've never hit anybody in my life. I'm like the biggest wuss that ever existed, you know? So I think if we cannot be flexible in our identities, you know, then yeah, it's just, we're not really humans in that sense.
Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you. Can you answer?
Oh, yes.
I'm Alan Walker, lovely to meet you, and thank you, fantastic talk. As you were talking about comedy, you were talking about a whole range of things, and about how language is international. I was thinking about Dada, and I just wondered if do you see yourself as a sort of post-structural legacy of Dada? Is there a link there? Or,
I mean, to be honest, I don't understand. I try not to think about those things because I was not trained as an art historian. I really don't. I know Dada, and I was actually, let's say, I loved Dada as a late teen. I do, yeah. I mean, it's maybe in the sense of like the nonsense that Dada was important about. Some people have talked about, a couple people have mentioned Dada, critics. They mentioned fluxus, which is also kind of another legacy of Dada. And the only thing I like about that analogy, because fluxus is that I don't really understand fluxus after all these years. And I like that nature of it. You know, I think as an artist, it's very, I was talking about like being like this, but it's very hard as an artist to continue to not understand your own work, because the further you get along, let's say the trajectory of an artist is that you're working on certain things, and at some point, hopefully, people understand what you're doing, and that's when most artists press cruise control and they say, okay, people finally understand me. This is what I'm going to do. And actually, it's opposite. As soon as people understand what you're doing, you should stop doing that and you should do something else. Now, it's hard the further you get along, and that's why I like Fluxus, and the artists that I'm interested, the kind of movements I'm interested in are movements that after 20, 30 years, I can't explain to you what Flux is. There's something slippery about it. And I hope that maybe there's something about that in Slavs and Tatars, that it has a kind of a universe that's not, because I just find it very, even some of the best artists in the world, it's so, you know, most artists you can see from a mile away. You go into a major museum and you're like, okay, this is that artist, that artist, that artist. And there's actually not that many artists whom you can't recognize, they don't have a style, you know, like, I mean, let's say like, I think recently Mike Kelly or Isa Genskin, they're artists that there's no language. And I think that is a kind of aspiration, I think, as an artist, is to not have a given language. And Dada did that because it was against meaning per se. So I think it's interesting. I mean, definitely I think we share that legacy of looking at language not as a form of purely a vehicle for meaning, but a vehicle for non-meaning as well.
There's so many interesting parallels. The more you've been revealing your ideas this evening, the links are there, that the sort of international, and you've taken it onto a very different plane as well. So it's not and of course as academics and artists, we're interested in seeing the link, seeing the thing. You can't help but classify it away, and hence that. So it's not in saying that, it's not a criticism.
No,
I mean, just the opposite.
To the contrary, I'm very interested. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in actually reading these. I'm very interested in reading these understandings, because, to be honest, we never think about it. Sounds disingenuous, but we never think about our work as art. If you're an artist that talks about art in your subject matter, then you think about it. But because we have a subject matter which is so not art, we only have so much sort of brain span. So if we're thinking about something, we're thinking about language, politics, or rituals. And so we hopefully leave that thinking to critics and to academics. I have to say it's been a bit disappointing as an artist to see that it's, because of the pace of the art world, is that there's not much time for curators and others to engage with your work. Like, we actually get very little. When I started art at the age of 30, I came into it from another career, so I had a kind of very utopian idea that it's going to be a bunch of dialogue, and it's not at all. You know, like, nobody actually engages with your work. That's why I was talking about the criticism. It's important to have real criticism about your work, because I don't want fluff pieces. I don't want people sort of saying, oh, this is great. I want to understand the work from what it means as art. We never think about our work what it means as art. We think about it what it means as discourse that happens to use art as a language, you know, but not per se as art. So.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. I hope the audience will agree with me that has been extremely stimulating and leaves us with not only thoughts but also feelings that we find hard to describe. But maybe we'll just contemplate on those feelings. We don't have to fully understand. Yeah. But thank you so much, Payam. And I hope you enjoyed this evening. Starting from next Tuesday, in this very space, we're starting a new round of our summer program comprising different movie images work, archival materials, associated visual materials to look at. And every week it's going to be featuring new artwork. So I do hope you come back and stay in touch. And please join me to thank Payam for this evening.